Heading up the news from Dorchester this week are a new chancellor at UMass Boston and a state representative deciding not to run for re-election. To fill us in is the managing editor and publisher of the Dorchester Reporter, Bill Forry. Thank you very much for being with us, Bill.
Thanks, Chris.
Bill, we just heard the news about Marcelo Suarez Orozco being the new chancellor at UMass Boston. This is a permanent chancellor, not an interim person. And after all these years of instability, what difference does this make to Dorchester?
Well, it remains to be seen. This is a new figure who very few of us have met yet. Dr. Suarez Orozco is from Los Angeles. He's originally from Argentina. 63-year-old academic who it really has been on the West Coast for most of his career. At UCLA, most recently, he's been the dean, one of the deans at UCLA. What's interesting about him so far is he's a consensus figure on a campus here in Boston, UMass Boston, where it's been quite divisive over the issue of who will lead the campus. The last time UMass convened a search committee and attempted to identify finalists, the faculty at the UMass Boston campus really kind of revolted against that and objected to the whole process, objected to the way that the former Chancellor Keith Motley had been broomed out of office, essentially. A lot of bad feelings on the campus at that point about that issue. The tone of that has now shifted and changed, and I think that the present search committee that just wrapped up its work, full disclosure, my wife, Linda Forry, was on that committee along with 23 other people. There was more consensus around how to pick the person. And ultimately, the faculty union at UMass Boston has unanimously endorsed Dr. Suarez Orozco's candidacy. He was confirmed earlier this week by the UMass board. It's going to be interesting to see how he fits in because he is new to Boston. The chancellor's job traditionally has not just been about being the face of the university on the campus. It looks outward, and it has to build consensus with political leaders, has to work with the mayor, the governor, other legislative leaders, counselors to get buy-in for projects on the campus, such as the first ever dorms, which are now on the campus of UMass Boston. That's one thing that Keith Motley, Dr. Suarez Orozco's ultimate predecessor, did quite well. And so we'll see how he does. The initial take from people who've met him on campus is quite positive, and I think he's seen as a popular figure. His life story is quite interesting. Came to the U.S. from Argentina at age 17, really under some threat of political violence that was going on in Argentina at the time. Kind of made his own way here in the United States and worked his way up the ladder in academia. Not unlike a lot of UMass Boston students do, first generation Americans, first people in their family to go to college in the U.S. And I think in that sense, he kind of fits the mold of the university's image over the years at least. But UMass Boston has been changing dynamically over the last decade in terms of student body and the campus's growth. He'll have a big task in front of him.
Speaking of predecessors, one of the successors to Linda Dorcina Forry is state rep in Dorchester, Mattapan. Dan Cullinane, it seems it wasn't that long ago he stepped into the job, and now he says he's not going to run for re-election. What did you think about that? Well,
Representative Cullinane's been in office since 2013. He is a young man. He's, I believe, 34 years old. This is his dream job, as he told us this week in announcing that he's leaving it. And it was a bit of a surprise to some that such a young state rep, he doesn't have another job, according to him, that he's leaving the job for. I think part of his calculus is that the seat that he represents, the 12th Suffolk, is predominantly people of color seat. The demographics of that seat would tend to lean towards a person of color winning that election. He's been challenged twice in the last 2 election cycles and faced some fairly stiff competition from a candidate named Javon Lissette, Haitian-American attorney from Mattapan. Cullinane was successful in beating him both times.
But I think he got less than 52% of the vote in both of those.
Yeah, many of the Mattapan precincts, for instance, went for Lissette, and Cullinane's base in Dorchester and in Milton really were able to put him over the top. But I think given those changes and given also a bit of a nastiness in those races that existed, it was tough on a family. He has a young family. Dan Cullinane does, two children under 2, and that was part of the rationale he gave this week for for deciding to leave. I think it's fair to say, too, that in this presidential election cycle, there's likely to be more competition that arises. And I would expect to see a very competitive and in this open field now. There'll be more than one candidate who seeks this seat, and I would expect to see 3 or 4, maybe more people trying to make it. Cullinane, I will say, was well respected in the building and in the community for his work. He was very successful in transit equity issues in particular. He points to the investment in the Mattapan trolley that's happened on his watch. The Fairmount line is growing, and there's a new pilot program that he was really shepherding through the legislature, which the MBTA has approved for the Fairmount line now. So he can point to some real accomplishments over his 5 years.
This is a presidential year. It's normal for a lot of the local people here to be backing some of these presidential candidates. I hear a lot about Warren. I don't know about other people. What are you seeing out there?
Right. Well, we did a story this week asking our local elected officials who they were with, and some of them are very much out there for candidates. Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley obviously is out and very active for Elizabeth Warren. And Warren is the choice, the most frequent choice of those who are out publicly. Steve Tompkins, the sheriff of Suffolk County, is out for her. Anissa Sabi-George, Dan Cullinane in our neck of the woods. And so that's obvious. She's the hometown choice. Another hometown option was Deval Patrick, who has now since dropped out of the race. Interestingly, Representative Dan Hunt of Dorchester backed Deval Patrick very publicly last week before the New Hampshire primary. And Hunt is making a case now for Deval Patrick as a VP choice potentially, and that could come to fruition depending on who the nominee ultimately is. But many of the other elected officials we've talked to have been keeping their powder dry. Mayor Walsh, who has been, attached to Joe Biden over the years in a public way, has not endorsed anybody and kind of sat out New Hampshire, which is unusual for a Boston mayor not to go all in for someone in New Hampshire and marshal his or her resources to the north. But that didn't happen this time, and I think that's an indicator of just how dynamic this Democratic field still is. And also, with early voting coming up soon in Boston, in Massachusetts, but in Boston in particular, our electorate will be able to start voting on February 24th at City Hall. There'll be satellite locations in the neighborhoods that week as well. In Dorchester and Mattapan on Thursday the 27th, people will be able to vote at All Saints Church that day, or at the First Parish Church of Dorchester, or the Mildred Avenue Community Center in Mattapan. It's an interesting idea because these primaries, what we've seen is such dynamism right at the end, right before, like in New Hampshire, with Amy Klobuchar kind of surging at the end there, and Elizabeth Warren and Joe Biden fading. It'll be interesting to see how early voting is impacted by that kind of changes that are going on.
Well, I'm also looking at how a couple of city councilors from Dorchester are coming at the Boston Public Schools. Councilor Sabi-George in the Education Committee. She has an agenda, and of course, Councilor Andrea Campbell. Yeah. She has some things she'd like to see done. What do you read between the two of them? Well,
I think that there's this energy on the council right now. They do feel, I think, empowered to use their bully pulpit more forcefully on issues like BPS. And those two councilors in particular have been very active on those issues all along in their career. I think Councilor Campbell, now that she's no longer the council president, is looking to build on her agenda specifically on BPS. And Councilor Sabi-George, who chaired the Education Committee, she doesn't right now in the new council, but she wants to be forceful on those issues. She's a Boston Public School teacher formerly, so not unusual, and I think we're going to see more of that from this council, really propelling their own individual agendas and trying to carve out a path for themselves going forward.
And finally, I know there are more things to talk about and more updates, so if people want to look for that online, what's the best way?
Best way is at .news.com, or you can buy the print edition of the Dorchester Reporter pretty much anywhere in Dorchester and Mattapan.
Thank you very much for being with us.
You're welcome.
Bill Forry from the Dorchester Reporter. Up ahead, a pathway to opportunities in food services. We'll tell you about a free program offered by Community Servings.